Thank you, Maria, and my fellow panelists. Unlike our brother Jack, I've not been kidnapped. And unlike my brother from India, the situation in Nigeria is, I'm happy you admitted, is complex, but it's also completely different from other situations anywhere in the world, in part because, one, Nigeria is the only country with a 50-50 percentage of Christians and Muslims. Ironically, the Christians in Nigeria are the richest in material terms. They're also the most educated. They perhaps constitute about 80% of the educated elite in Nigeria. So when we talk about the persecution of Christians, the situation is largely applicable to what has been going on with the Christian minorities in northern Nigeria. And my presentation will focus on both narration, but also engagement. And by way of conclusion, I take and pay attention to ongoing conversations in Nigeria about another report, different from this one, about the situation of Christians in Nigeria. So excuse me if I give the narrative, but also try to proffer what I call a solution, which is based on engagement. Because I think that we can be lamenting and lamenting, but like I always say, you can read the book of Lamentation, but there is still the book of Revelation ahead. So I admit that Nigeria has become largely a killing field, but this development has arisen in the last 15 years in terms of its spread across Nigeria. But if you're a Christian, as I am, living in northern Nigeria, where I was born and where I am working, you will understand that this has been a slow-burning candle right from before Nigeria became an independent country until date. So I will try to explain. We speak different languages in Nigeria, and I often say that in Nigeria, we think in vernacular and try to speak in English. So the word persecution is rather ambiguous, and it's very difficult to define because now it's used to capture a range of distortions of the Nigerian landscape, arising from the destruction of property, the ravaging of farmlands, killings by gangs of Islamists in the middle of the night, banditry, kidnapping. It's a Molotov cocktail that defies, and I'm happy you made the point, that the Nigerian situation always, as now, is difficult and also complex. So I suggest that, like Moses, we take off our shoes when we are talking about Nigeria. Now, the biggest challenge has been, as I said, the appropriate language to use. The people who kill us in the middle of the night, whether they're killing Muslims or killing Christians, their anthem of death is Allahu Akbar. And it is therefore impossible to more or less disentangle these atrocities from religion. Indeed, until the last 10 or 15 years with the emergence of Boko Haram, Christian persecution was largely seen in the destruction of churches, in the destruction of institutions belonging to the church, whether they were churches, whether they were hospitals or schools, that spanned on, at a time when there was no social media, but also there wasn't much of this being reported. And even when it was being reported, Nigerian Christians to the south didn't think that this was a serious problem. They always associated with the distorted landscape called northern Nigeria. Now, I make a point because speaking from where I am, this confusion is, the language of persecution is also, it has captured our imagination. But let me, for a moment, speak about myself. My name is Matthew Hassan Kuka, and Hassan, as you know, is an Arabic but Muslim name. And I'm a twin. My twin brother would have been Hussein had he been alive. But it also means that I have certain peculiar experiences that are not just about textbook theology. They're not also just about persecution in abstract terms. Because in my view, in Nigeria, the concept of persecution has also clouded the rich tapestry of the social fabric of Nigeria. This is a country where not until long ago we were laughing, we were celebrating, we were living together, We've never always been permanently at war. The challenge, of course, is that to understand how we got to where we are, we need to take into consideration the collapse and the failure of politics in Nigeria. I was ordained Bishop of Sokoto on the 8th of September 2021. And Sokoto is extreme northwest and is also coterminous with the boundaries of the old Sokoto Empire. And actually, Sokoto is the Vatican of the Muslims in Nigeria, so to say. So if we were talking about persecution from the point of view of people going around with cutlasses or machetes or guns looking for whom to kill, we would not exist in Sokoto. But on the 8th of September, when I was ordained bishop, the Sultan of Sokoto, who is the head of all the Muslims in Nigeria and who is a personal friend of mine, actually paid hotel bills for for a good number of my guests. Also, the biggest gift I got on my ordination was a huge car, which was a Prado Jeep, as we call them in Nigeria, which was donated to me by a Muslim, and who said to me, please, Bishop, I see the kind of landscape you're going to be operating in. Therefore, I need you to take this car and use it for your pastoral work. Of course, he knew that pastoral work in Sokoto will include, among other things, working among Muslims. I make the point because even on the 30th of June this year, His Eminence, the Sultan of Sokoto, was in our premises, where I invited our former head of state to join me to open a big 300 computer facility, which we have in Sokoto as part of our effort at integrating young people and introducing them to ICT beyond the issues of religion. So in Sokoto, I travel in my official regalia. I've never had to wear a shirt out of my house simply because I don't want to be identified. And when I travel out of Sokoto, unless the Muslims who are in the airport don't know, I see the way I'm received at the airport. I go to catch a plane. Unless the Sultan is traveling or the governor is traveling, my seat would always be seat number 1A in the plane. These are verifiable facts. I'm saying, therefore, that we need to ask ourselves, we weren't always like this. How did we therefore get to where we are? And I make this point because there's been a lot of hysteria in Nigeria over the fact that there's another report that came out suggesting, throwing around some wild figures about what has happened, what is happening in Nigeria, allegations that are not verifiable, but also because the Nigerian environment is already open to this kind of characterizations. There's, of course, naturally been quite a lot of tension. Nigeria is still bleeding, but we must place this bleeding in context. The last 8 years of the government of Muhammadu Buhari, of blessed memory, contributed massively in leaving the massive debris across northern Nigeria today. Because we must remember that the scene of the crime of religious persecution is in northern Nigeria. Other forms of violence have spread across other parts of Nigeria. They are ethnically related and there are all kinds of things. But right now in Nigeria, almost everything is conflated into religious persecution. But I therefore make the point that unless we understand the context of this, because in the last 8 years when Buhari was president, Buhari himself was a Muslim. And he also made sure there were some standing agreements among the Nigerian political elite in terms of power distribution. But for the first time in the history of our country, Buhari defied all those laws. He himself was a Muslim. Ordinarily, the Senate president would be a Christian, but he made the Senate president a Muslim, and made the speaker a Muslim, and the deputy speaker a Muslim. And literally every head of the security agencies in Nigeria was a Muslim. So this caused quite a lot of anxiety. Although looking back now, the Muslims themselves don't know what hit them, because despite all this, northern Nigeria ended up being the worst part of Nigeria in terms of the debris of violence. So I make this point because there are some noticeable changes that are beginning to take place now in Nigeria. That's why I think in this conversation we must also open the door for dialogue, because there have been significant changes. The report itself makes mention of the fact that in Nigeria today, the president of our country is a Muslim, but his wife is a pastor, and he obviously is very proud of that. We also have a situation different from what we had in the last 8 years, in which the chief of general staff of the Nigerian military is a Christian. Only 2 months or so ago, the president appointed a Christian as the head of the political party that is in power. He appointed another Christian as the head of the Electoral Commission. So I make these points because they may not be significant, but I think they help to create a condition of confidence. And by way of trying to conclude, I think what we now need is a robust strategy for engagement. And we in Nigeria must also come to terms with the fact that this mess belongs to us. We thank ACN, we thank a lot of other international brothers and sisters who continue to work along with us. But the heavy lifting must be done by us in Nigeria. And this is why I think that we need a strategy of engagement, because according to the report, which quotes the Terrorism Index report for 2025, it acknowledges that terrorist attacks in Nigeria have declined by 34% as in 2024. So this is a reason for hope. We're not out of the woods yet, by no stretch of the imagination. But there are symbolic gestures that government is showing. Also, at the level of the Catholic Bishops' Conference, we are also making quite a bit of effort. We've already sat down with the president to discuss some of the problems that the church faces. The president himself was physically here at the inauguration of the Holy Father. He also sent a delegation to the Vatican here at the death of our blessed Holy Father, Pope Francis. So I make this point because we have a country to build. The challenge of building that country belongs to us. But this report more or less indicts Nigeria, and Nigeria stands indicted to the point that there is still a lot of work to be done. By way of conclusion, therefore, I think that, first of all, the federal government of Nigeria must acknowledge that we are not in a good place, but also have the courage and the confidence to seek for help by way of dialogue and conversation. The 12 northern states, for example, that in 2000 decided to adopt and embrace Sharia law, have created the condition that Muslim extremists continue to exploit by the application of blasphemy laws and setting up Hizbah groups that have continued to terrorize ordinary Nigerians. A young girl was killed in Sokoto called Deborah. Another young girl was killed in Kano on grounds of blasphemy. But also, even another Muslim was killed in Sokoto on grounds of blasphemy. And we're saying that if we are living under constitutional democracy, citizens guilty or found guilty or complicit should be punished, but through the due process of law. So Nigeria cannot have a double decker of laws. One, that a section of the country wants to live under Islamic law, whereas the Constitution limits Islamic law to private and personal matters. So those enforcements are necessary. So finally, I want to thank the Age to Church in Need for the tremendous work that you continue to do, not only to support us, but also to voice these conditions. And I want to say, by way of conclusion here, that the biggest debate in Nigeria now is about the designation of Nigeria as a country of concern. I am aware, because I was also instrumental, I read the text of the designation of Nigeria as a country of concern on the 11th of December 2020. In which the Trump administration said, governments whose leaders have allowed perpetrators of various persecutions to act with impunity pose a national security threat to the United States and to the world. I think Nigeria does not pose a threat to itself. Significantly, we pose a threat to other nations, but I think the challenge for us is for the American government to do exactly what the Biden administration didn't do. That is to close the door to Nigeria having access to the necessary equipment that they required to end the atrocities of Boko Haram. I think, without generating any controversy, the Obama administration that closed that door and sabotaged the presidential ambitions of Jonathan and helped to install Buhari, who ended up being a disaster in Nigeria, helped to bring us to where we are. I'm convinced that by now, we would have seen largely the back of Boko Haram. So I therefore want to appeal to President Trump, because I think the work that President Trump has done in the Middle East signals it's a significant development in the struggle for the things we call interreligious, the crisis we call religious persecution. Because the Middle East and finances from the Middle East have contributed significantly to the problems and the tensions that Nigeria has. So my conclusion is that no, Nigeria should not be designated a country of concern. Rather, the international community should help to encourage Nigeria. And I think that the Nigerian government, along with the Christian leaders in Nigeria, along with the Muslim leaders, must begin to map out the best strategy for us to achieve the kind of national cohesion that we had before the tragedy of banditry extremism descended upon us. I think over 200 million Nigerians are significant enough to tilt the balance of tolerance in Africa, and we can contribute massively to peace in the world. I thank you very much, and I'm sorry if I went beyond my time. Thank you.